Today I have 5 intermediate outdoor photography techniques that can really help improve your photography skills. I was starting with the easiest techniques and then moving on to some more advanced skills later in the video, so be sure to watch the video until the end, as I'm sure there's lots to take away for most intermediate or beginner photographers. Think of this as a photographer's compendium, if you will, a video that you can watch through, save and use for future reference. So first up, and probably the easiest technique of them all, is exposure bracketing. This technique comes in really handy when we have a scene in front of us that contains really bright highlights and really dark shadows. When the highlights and shadows exceed the dynamic range of our camera, we will lose detail in either the highlights or the shadow areas of the photo. An easy way to overcome this loss of detail is to take multiple exposures and then blend those exposures together in an editing software such as Adobe Lightroom. Depending on the exposure values of the scene, we may need to take either 3 or 5 photos with different exposure times. For this example, I'm using 3 exposures, one exposing for the brightest parts of the photo, one for the darkest and one in the middle. I'm using my histogram to tell me when I'm safely recording all of the detail in the shot. Now I can do this in 2 ways. If I'm using a tripod and there's little movement in the image, I'll just dial in my settings by hand and take 3 exposures. If there's movement, say the clouds are moving quickly or I'm hand holding, then I'll use the auto bracketing feature built into my camera, as this allows all of the different exposures to be taken very quickly, meaning the images will be very similar, helping us blend those photos together later on. With the auto bracketing feature, we have to adjust the increments between our exposure times to suit the scene. A stop and a half is a good starting point. Then you can choose 3 or 5 exposures to suit the scene. Typically, I'll expose the shot as a balanced exposure, and then as the camera automatically shoots the bracket, it will take a shot overexposed and one shot underexposed, creating a series of photos. Every camera is slightly different though, so check your manual for how to set up the auto exposure bracketing correctly. I would advise shooting in RAW and setting a manual white balance setting such as daylight or shade. This will keep your white balance consistent between the shots. Blending these images together in Lightroom is really straightforward. Firstly, highlight all of your images by clicking and holding Shift on the first image, then click on the last image. Once these are highlighted, right click and choose Photo Merge and HDR. Then let the auto feature weave its magic. You'll then be left with a DNG file that has all of the dynamic range of all of the photos that you took, allowing us to retain detail in both the highlights and the shadows. Later on in the video, I'll be showing you how to manually blend those images together in Photoshop, as sometimes this can give us greater control in the edit. Next up, we have a technique called time blending, and as the title suggests, it's a way of blending time. For example, we can take a nice shot of light on our foreground, and then we can wait for clouds in the scene to be in the right position, and then capture another shot, and then later we can blend those 2 images together in post-production, creating our final image. This is especially great for taking shots at either sunrise or sunset, as the light and the colour in the scene changes quickly. My advice for shooting this way is to have the camera on your tripod and continue to shoot the scene without moving for a duration of time. Maybe take a shot every 15 seconds or so as the light and colours change. When we get back to post-production, we can then choose which images we would like to blend to make the final photo. Again, I advise shooting in RAW and using a manual white balance setting to keep the colours nice and accurate. I keep my eye on the histogram to make sure my exposure of the scene remains consistent through the series of images. It may be necessary to change the shutter speed as the light changes. Generally though, I would keep my aperture and ISO the same. Time blending really gives us the creative freedom to create something truly unique, and we can achieve this by using both Lightroom and Photoshop. Firstly, after selecting the photos that I would like to blend, I'll run an edit on those photos in Lightroom. They need to look even in exposure and colours, otherwise it will make the final blend look unnatural. Once we are happy with our Lightroom edits, we can now open these images up in Photoshop stacked as layers. To do this, simply highlight both photos by clicking and holding Shift, then right click and choose Edit In, then open the layers in Photoshop. Photoshop will now automatically open and stack the 2 images together as layers for us. Now the first step whenever we are blending multiple images is to align the photos. So what can happen when we're taking a shots or a series of shots over a period of time is that the tripod might move a little bit. Maybe it's windy, or maybe we're on soft ground or something like that. So we need to get these images matching up, otherwise it makes the blending process nigh on impossible. So let's come over to our layers, click and hold Shift on both, and you can see that both are now highlighted. Now come up to Edit and Auto Align Layers. Check the automated feature and Photoshop will align the two layers so they match up exactly. If your camera did move between the shots, you'll need to crop out the edges of the frame, as you may be able to see the layer below. So now we have aligned our photos, we can create a layer mask on top of our layer. Simply come down to the layer mask icon to add the mask. By default, it's going to give us a white mask, meaning the layer below is not visible. If we grab a paintbrush and select black, we can now paint black on our white layer mask. When we do this, we are revealing the photo in the layer below. So we want to reveal the light in the foreground and the bottom layer, so let's paint on the layer mask with a black soft edge brush. And as you can see, we're now painting that light into the image. If I turn off this layer, you can see exactly what we have done. Once we have finished our masking, we can then flatten the image and click Save. This will now save our blended image as a TIFF file alongside our original photos in the Lightroom catalogue. We can then make a few finer edits if needed. It's a super simple but really effective technique. Focus stacking is a really useful technique that we can use to achieve sharp photos from front to back when our depth of field is too large to capture the scene with a reasonable aperture. So the more we stop our lens aperture down, the greater our depth of field becomes. Now f16 or f22 is usually the smallest aperture most full frame or APS-C lenses offer. The issue with stopping down your aperture this far is that the light diffracts as it passes through the tiny hole, resulting in a softer image. Now for shooting architecture and landscapes, it's often best to shoot at the sweet spot of the lens, meaning the best possible image quality. This will vary from lens to lens, but typically it's between f5.6 and f11. So say we have tested our lens and we know f7.1 is the best possible image quality we can get. We can then take a look at our scene in front of us and determine if we can get everything sharp from front to back in one shot. Typically, focusing about a third of the way into the scene will give us the largest depth of field. So the best thing to do is take a few test shots, examine your photo to see whether you have acceptable sharpness in your foreground and your background. If one or both are not acceptable, then we can take several images with our focus point in different places in the image and then blend those images together in post-production. There's lots of factors which determine depth of field, such as focal length and how close you are to your foreground subject. So the amount of photos you need to take will depend on your setup in front of you. Typically, the longer your focal length, the shallower your depth of field will be. And also, the closer you are to your foreground subject, the shallower your depth of field will be. Usually if I'm shooting with a standard zoom or a wide angle lens, I'll take 3 images, one focused on the background, one on the midground and one on the foreground. Quite often though, it's only the foreground and background images that are required in the edit. It's always better to have a choice though. Like before, we need to make sure that we are locked on a tripod and our settings are all in manual mode, including our white balance. Ideally, we should be shooting in RAW, and I would advise using a 2-second timer to eradicate camera shake. So in the edit, we will follow similar steps as the time blending process. Usually I edit all of my images first in Lightroom. What I'll do is edit my first image and then highlight all of the chosen images and click sync to copy the same edit to all of the shots. This makes sure all of the photos have the same treatment applied and look the same. Once I have my photos highlighted, I'm going to click edit and open as layers in Photoshop. Like before, we'll auto align our layers and create a white layer mask. We have the image focused on the background on the top and the foreground below. Firstly, I'm going to check where my depth of field falls away, somewhere about here. So I'm just going to paint black here with a medium soft edge paintbrush across the frame. As before, I flatten the image, click Save to create the TIFF file in Lightroom. If you need more than 2 images, you just simply add another mask to your middle image and repeat the same steps. Like I mentioned earlier, we can use exactly the same Photoshop layers technique for blending exposures whilst we're exposure bracketing. Now this gives us greater control than the automated blending features in Lightroom. These can be especially useful if we're, say, got moving objects in the scene, such as water or lots of movement in trees, that type of thing. You can be more selective about which parts of the image you blend together. Now, long exposure blending is a great technique that allows us to blend different amounts of motion blur in an image. Generally, with a long exposure of 5 seconds or more, we tend to get a very ethereal feel. You know, the water gets smoothed out, it looks a bit like cotton wool. Now, whilst this can look great for some shots, for others it just doesn't work so well. So when I'm out in the field, I'm often experimenting with different shutter speeds to get a certain look. And quite often I'll decide to blend different exposure times to help create a unique photo that has an ethereal feel whilst retaining texture and detail in the water. With long exposures, generally, unless it's really dark, I'll be using a neutral density filter to increase my exposure time. If I'm using a 6-stop filter, for example, I'll take a shot without the filter first. This will give me a fast shutter speed, and then I'll pop the filter on and increase my exposure time by 6 stops for a longer shutter speed. From there, usually I'll up my ISO and my shutter speed together by 1-stop increments. This means I retain the same exposure whilst increasing my shutter speed, which in turn gives me different amounts of motion blur. I find it's easier to increase the ISO than it is changing filters. Quite often changing filters can move the camera, meaning images might not properly align in post-production. Now, as before, we will edit our chosen images in Lightroom and Photoshop following the previous methods, but this time we can get a little bit more creative as we paint in different textures to the final shot. This photography technique always feels really artistic to me. It's something I really enjoy doing. I really think it can add impact to your long exposure water photos. So as before, I've edited the shots in Lightroom and opened them as layers in Photoshop, auto-align them and added a white layer mask. This time I'm going to grab a black brush and set my opacity to 10%. And now I will adjust my brush size using the bracket keys and paint in some of those wonderful textures and details. I prefer to build this up slowly with smooth brush strokes, a little bit at a time, until I get the desired effects. Once finished, I will flatten the image and click Save to create the final TIFF in Lightroom. Next, I want to show you a great masking feature within Lightroom that I use all of the time when I'm masking certain parts of my photo. It's a great way, a very, very effective way for getting controlled local adjustments. So in this image, I feel I need to darken the sky a little as it feels a little bit too bright for my taste. So in the past, you would have only been able to do this with either the graduated tool, the brush tool, or the radial filter. But the problem with using such a tool was that the mask would often conflict with areas of the image that you didn't want it to be affected by. Here, for example, the graduated tool would cover those rocks that are jutting up into the landscape. But in recent times, Lightroom has had some really powerful updates that have added some amazing features that really help with this kind of work. So let's come up to our masking tools, and as you can see, we have some really interesting options like background and people, plus all of the usual tools like the brush tool, etc. For this, I'm going to select the sky, and as you can see, Lightroom has made a selection for us and created a mask of the sky. We can now adjust the exposure of the sky independently of the rocks in the foreground. So let's dial in some negative exposure, some contrast, reduce the shadows, boost the whites, darken the blacks, and increase the saturation. What we will find is that sometimes the transition between the horizon and the sky can look a little bit too harsh and unnatural. So what we can do is select the subtract button, which allows us to use another tool to subtract a part of the mask we have already added to the image, in this case the sky. So let's choose the brush tool and increase the feathering to 100 and reduce the flow rate so we can build up the effect slowly. Now let's paint across the horizon in long, smooth brush strokes until we're happy with the transition. Let's take a look at the before and after by clicking the small eye icon here next to the mask. And as you can see, by adding in these brush strokes and making that transition smoother, it really helps to make a more natural feel to this mask. If you're wondering how professional outdoor photographers get amazing photos on a consistent basis, I highly recommend checking out this video over here, which will give you some more must-know tips. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button because that really helps me out. Leave a comment below as well, I'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then why not subscribe? Okay guys, until next week, see you soon.